Okay, welcome back. So for the second half of the presentation, I want to talk about the sort of the state of the working class in the U.S., in particular in terms of working class organization and activism. So to look at workers' movements and the labor movement and what's happened and not happened with it recently. And this is all rooted in a question, I think a really fair question that a lot of people ask around the world, but also within the U.S., which is, how is it that in the face of this this sort of economic situation that I've just walked through, how is it that workers have been so unorganized, so shown very little signs of a fight in the U.S.? And for that, I think we have to trace a little bit of the history of the labor movement in the U.S. and the workers' movement, and how the working class has changed over time. So, the U.S. was really the epicenter of this giant collapse that brought down economies all around the world, right? It's created this incredible devastation for people all around, and all around the world there have been major mobilizations of working class rebellion, but not so much in the U.S. I mean, a bit now we're seeing signs of it with the Occupy movement and some other movements, and that's why we'll go there next. But for the most part, the U.S. working class has been very passive and very, very weak. And so there's this very legitimate question about how is that the case? Especially in a place where the labor movement has such an important history, and advances and gains by the working class have been so profound historically in the U.S. So, on one hand, we can look at, and often what happens is when people try to explain, why is the working class so passive in the U.S.? People say, well, trade unions are quite weak. That's true, right? And they talk a lot about, sort of ideological conditions in the U.S. And these are also quite real, right? I spoke about the idea of the sort of American dream that's really, really deeply embedded in the American consciousness, right? This is changing, I think, but this idea that things will get better and I just have to work really, really hard. And what that leads to is a situation in which if you're not doing well, it suggests that the problem is that you haven't worked hard enough. Right? So there's an individualist attitude within the U.S. that I need to kind of work hard. I'm responsible for my own success or my own failure. And a disinclination to look towards sort of structural issues to explain why people are struggling so much. Part of this American ideology is also a conception that's been around since the 1950s, really. In the 1960s, when the middle class really sprung up in the U.S. and large numbers of people sort of moved up, the socioeconomic ladder, and it created a situation in which Americans are very reticent or hesitant to call themselves members of the working class. Everybody is sure they're a member of the middle class. Even people that are quite poor by objective standards often think of themselves as middle class. So all of these things are true about, why, workers in the U.S. have been relatively passive. But to really understand why this is the case, I think we have to go much deeper, and we really need a historical materialist sort of analysis of what's been going on, and to look at some of the really important and deep structural changes that have taken place in the U.S. economy over the last 50 years or so, and changes within the composition of the U.S. working class itself. And the idea of going through these things is that, of course, if we really want to figure out how do we build a successful workers' movement in the US and internationally, we have to understand why it's not happening in places where we would like to see it or think it should be happening. So, in terms of the state of labor in the US working class is very highly unorganized. Right now, only just over 10% of the entire workforce is unionized. And in the private sector, it's only at about 6%. About 30 or 35% of public sector workers are unionized. The union movement itself is in a deep state of crisis, and it has been for a long time. It's been hemorrhaging members for the better part of 2 or 3 decades, and its political power has been shrinking significantly. The really big, powerful unions in the US, and they still have a fair amount of political influence, have been incredibly loyal to the Democratic Party in the US. And if you don't know US politics, you've got the Republican Party, which is sort of a right-wing party, and you've got the Democratic Party, which is sort of a center-right party, right? It's historically thought of as the sort of party of working people, but few people think of it in those terms anymore. Both parties are completely corporatist parties. But nonetheless, the big labor unions have been extremely loyal to the Democratic Party, despite the fact that the party has sold them out time and time again over the last several decades. That loyalty is tied in part to the deep bureaucratization of the big labor unions in the US, where they've become very much institutionalized in the political system, and you have a small sort of elite cast of leaders that are very, very personally and economically tied to the political class in the US. There's been some rumblings in the last decade or so of dissatisfaction with the state of labor unions from within the unions themselves. But nonetheless, this has been the trend where they're very big, they're very top-down, and they tend to marginalize the more sort of militant and activist members within their unions. On top of that, in the US, most workers, even most union workers, have little or no experience with strikes or with, strong militant worker actions, and they've been subjected for years and years to really powerful anti-union propaganda. In the most recent 3 or 4 years, public sector unions, which I said cover about 30 or 35% of workers in the US, about 35% of public sector workers are unionized. The public sector unions have been under a very serious attack from the right wing. So at the moment, the sort of balance of forces in the US is not very favorable to workers. So, very briefly, maybe not briefly, the goal of this part is to sort of walk through kind of what's been going on with the labor movement and try to explain sort of why it is that workers have been relatively passive in the US. Well, the US labor history goes back to the late 1800s with some really big movements and the emergence of the labor movement worldwide. So you had for instance, the Haymarket riot in 1886, which I hope you've heard of, but maybe you haven't. This was part of a movement and a series of strikes fighting for the 8-hour workday that ended up in a very violent confrontation with police, which a number of anarchist union organizers were executed or hung for. And it's the Haymarket protests are the origins of May Day, of International Labor Day. And then there were a series of strikes, the founding of, for instance, the Industrial Workers of the World, which was sort of a major important militant union in the early 1900s. But it was really in the 1930s that the labor movement in the US really exploded and took off. And this was a period right after the Great Depression. We had a very high level of militancy in the working class, lots of labor unrest and strikes. And in that period, socialists, communists, Trotskyists, and anarchists played an extremely important role in leading those movements. And as a result of these movements, there were lots of big wins for workers. Legislative wins, like legal wins, like the right to have unions to begin with, child labor laws, worker health and safety laws, minimum wage laws, etc. And this was a period, right, where labor unions came out very strongly for, and the working class, for Theodore Roosevelt, the president at the time after the Great Depression, who instituted this thing called the New Deal, which was a whole series of major government efforts to combat the crisis of the Great Depression. It was, many big victories happened at this time for workers. But it was also in this period that the big unions and the CIO, which is the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which is a big union federation, was formed in the US, and this was the beginning of the period where the unions started to get very closely tied to the Democratic Party in the US. During World War II, the sort of militancy of the labor movement decreased quite a bit, and lots of workers and labor unions got behind government in order to support the war effort, and then essentially subordinated their own issues and concerns to issues of the war, and that meant subordinating themselves not only to government calls for hard work and an end to strikes, but also the interests of businesses that were producing war materials. After World War II, the US entered the Cold War, and if you did not grow up in the US, I don't think it's possible to understand how profoundly powerful the Cold War was in shaping Americans' attitudes about the world. Right? This was a period in which there was an enormous anti-communist crusades in the US. A period referred to as McCarthyism, after a US senator that went on a witch hunt for anybody that might have had any smell on them of being a left-wing radical. The big labor unions required their workers to sign loyalty oaths to the government and to kick out their communist and radical members. And so the more militant unions and union members, who had been so important in building the labor movement from the beginning, were increasingly marginalized in the US at this time. And through this period, unions got more democratic, they got much more corrupt, they ended up being, in many cases, sort of tied to the mafia and other sort of forms of corruption. And in many ways, they became sort of enforcers of the will of employers. And all of this is as they continue to get closer and closer and increasingly dependent on the Democratic Party. During this period, this Cold War, from the 50s into the 80s, the unions stayed pretty strong, but they weren't very militant, right? So it became normal and kind of accepted practice that employers, negotiated with unions. Workers didn't demand too much. Employers understood that they had sort of limits and how far they could push the workers. And all through this period, the leadership of the big unions became increasingly removed from the interests and the sort of day-to-day lives of the rank-and-file members of the unions, increasingly top-down and increasingly elite and privileged. So, one of the articles you read was by an American a member of the Fourth International named Dan Labatz, and in a piece I originally thought I'd have you read, but didn't have you read, he writes this, and I think it's worth paying attention to. So this period, he's talking about this period I just discussed. The domestication of the labor union officialdom, or officials, and the institutionalization of labor relations, together with the passage of time and the passing of the so-called greatest generation into labor. The greatest generation refers to the generation of people that fought in World War II. My grandparents, for instance. Right? This process resulted in the gradual stifling of the layer of working class activists whose shop floor organization in the workplace had not only been the source of the union's power, but also represented the social milieu crucial to nurturing a revolutionary socialist left. What he's talking about here is that this period from the 50s into the 80s, where the unions became institutionalized, bureaucratic, top-down, began to marginalize their members, was a period in which not only did the unions move away from sort of militant activism, I was really going fast. Okay, so the point here is that not only did the unions become less militant and more sort of institutionalized, but they also started to eliminate the very sort of cultural and social settings that produces militant workers. And so this was a period all the way back 50 years ago, beginning 50 years ago, when not only did the unions become more passive themselves, but the ability to regenerate a radical, class-conscious working class itself was undermined. I hope I'm making sense. So he says, without this leftist yeast, the working class loaf of bread fell flat. In other words, this is the beginning of the sort of unraveling of American class consciousness, he was suggesting. So we enter then into this neoliberal era that I hope you're all now pretty well aware of. And you get this period of deregulation and privatization and all of that, austerity. But you also in the US get a massive, massive wave of deindustrialization and corporate restructuring. And what happened in the US is that the industrial heart, the manufacturing heart of the US, and the heart of the labor movement in the US, which was located in the north in the US, I'll put up a map in a minute, where steel and car manufacturing in particular were big, those areas started to deindustrialize. And the big manufacturing industries started to move their factories out of those states where there were strong unions and a long history of working class militancy into the southern states of the US that were unorganized and much, much more conservative and had much lower wages. So this is why the area around Detroit, where the heart of the auto industry, and Cleveland and Chicago and some of this area is now referred to as the Rust Belt, because there used to be areas that produced steel and big machinery, and now they've been completely decimated. So manufacturing moved first to the south in the US and then increasingly overseas. So the US manufacturing sector is way, way, way smaller than it was even 20, 25 years ago. Accompanying this has been a decline in the labor process itself. In other words, this sort of shift towards mechanization and computerization, towards what's called just-in-time production. In other words, producing things not in huge quantities and then waiting to sell them, but small batches really quickly, producing parts and things just in time. as you cut down on manufacturing and industry, you see in the US a big increase in the service sector and a big increase in the use of part-time and temporary workers. I was talking in the break a little bit about this is happening in higher education, even in the US, where there's a shift away from hiring professors who have full-time tenured work to using deeply indebted, younger graduates on part-time and temporary bases. And under these conditions, it's much, much harder to organize.
Put the microphone near to you.
It's closed. The microphone stopped, I think.
There's the other one.
Okay.
We need your batteries in the back.
But we can use this one.
Take the other one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You want to keep moving?
Yeah.
Okay. I have so much that I'm not going to get to. Okay, that's all right. So here's the U.S. The area I have circled is the area that was really the heart of the industrial sector in the U.S., now called the Rust Belt. And the point of that last bit is that as heavy industry shut down in this part of the country, moved to other parts of the country, and in fact moved in particular south of the border into Mexico, not only did those jobs disappear, but the industrial working class in the U.S. itself was undermined. And so you had a decline in people working in and growing up working in industry with a history of union organizing, and more people moving into service sector work that had very little history of unionization and militant unionization in the U.S. And so you can start to see the sort of conditions continuing to snowball in which American workers are further and further and further removed from that history of radical militant labor organizing. I'll come back to this area in a minute. So as this happened, as all of these factories started to close and these industrial manufacturing areas in the north went into decline, this meant major collapses in the job market, collapses in wages and in living conditions, increases in crime and poverty in this part of the country. And then with that, increases in racism, increases in conservatism and parochialism, meaning like a very inward sort of small-scale focus by people. Middle-class whites started to flee, right, the areas, white flight, moving to the suburbs. And what all of this did was not only decimate unions themselves, manufacturing unions themselves in the U.S., but also to undermine working-class solidarity, and to start to really break down the sort of social institutions that form the basis for solidarity. And so we entered into a period after the 1980s, really the 1990s, where there's not much manufacturing work done in the U.S. The unions have been completely decimated. Like I said, there's now 6 to 7% of private sector workers in unions. And the entire generations growing up with very, very little experience in any form of labor movement, and especially in any form of sort of militant, radical labor movement. Stop that. There was a big moment in the history of the union movement, a bad moment, that happened in 1981 when the Patco, which was the union of air traffic controllers at airports, went on strike. And President Reagan fired all 11,000 striking air traffic controllers across the entire U.S. and ordered their union to be decertified. In other words, he destroyed the union entirely. And this was an incredible blow, what many consider like the beginning of a first massive blow that triggered the beginning of a decline in union power in the U.S. And it not only hurt the unions physically, it destroyed people emotionally and morally in the labor movement. So if you look at what's happened in the last 50 years of of labor in the U.S., you can see that the workforce and the percentage of the workforce that's unionized went from about 35% in the 1950s to now just about 11% in 2012. And it's continuing to decline. So there's been a steady and major collapse of the labor movement. If you look at the bottom of the slide, I point out that in the public sector, this is the place where there's some evidence of a remaining labor movement in the U.S. Sort of the heart of the labor movement is in the public sector. And in the last several years, it has become the target of a very explicit and very vicious attack by the right wing that's been incredibly successful as they have tried to sort of put the nail in the coffin of the U.S. labor movement. So we now have a situation where we have the majority of the workforce rooted in the service sector. Unionization rates are higher in the public sector within the service sector. But in the U.S., public sector workers have different rights than private sector workers. In many places, the rights of public sector workers are governed at a state-by-state level. This is a weird thing about the U.S. So each individual U.S. state has its own set of labor laws that govern public employees, state and county and local employees. So in many places they don't have the right to strike. That's not that uncommon around the world. But also in many places, public sector workers have no right to actually organize and collectively bargain. In other words, they don't have formal union rights. This is the case in Kentucky, for instance, where I came from. When I lived in Iowa, which is a little sort of in the center of the country, public employees had full right to form unions, and if workers formed a union, the boss, which in this case was some government body, was obliged to negotiate with them over wages and benefits and things. In Kentucky, public employees don't have the right to form unions. Most don't have the right to form unions at all. Or if they have the right to form a union, they can't force the government to actually sit down and negotiate anything. So effectively, they have no collective bargaining rights. All right. There's a lot to talk about here about how over the years the demographics of the American working class have changed, right? And historically, the working class, the militant working class, was white, was male. There was some sort of African American and European immigrant basis, but it was heavily male and heavily dominated by whites. In recent decades, that's changed a lot. So now not only do you have the changes in the working class in terms of its sort of relationship to the labor movement, but you have a different composition within the working class of now many, many more women, and in the U.S., large numbers of Latino and Hispanic immigrants, many of whom are undocumented. And this, at a time when people have become increasingly sort of vulnerable economically, has triggered, in many cases, tensions around issues of gender and race and nationality, all of which have made it very, very hard to rebuild the solidarity that had been sort of crushed within the working class, and of course then to rebuild effective labor unions. And in fact, what we've seen in the U.S. is it hasn't happened. The labor unions are incredibly weak. There's lots of sort of ways in which ideology in the working class has changed, and I've talked a little bit about that, but I'm going to skip over most of it. And then talk really briefly about what's been going on in the last couple of years, because this is really important. Like I said, the last remaining core of the labor movement in the U.S. is really, the heart of it is in the public sector. When President Obama was elected in 2009, lots of people on the sort of center and the left were very excited about him. He made wonderful promises and generated a lot of optimism. Unions spent $300 million to help him get elected in his first campaign. That's a lot, enormous amount. And in return for that, he promised labor that he was going to raise the minimum wage. The current minimum wage in the U.S. is about $7 an hour. So what's that, about 5 euros? It's tragic. He was going to raise it to $9.50, still way below what would constitute a living wage, but he promised that. He promised to sign what is called the Employee Free Choice Act, which is a law that would make it much, much easier for unions to organize new members, to remove some of the hurdles to union organization. And he said, and this is a quote, "If union rights are attacked, I'll put on my comfortable shoes and I'll walk the picket line with you." And so with this kind of rhetoric, he seduced a lot of the labor movement, which was already committed to the Democratic Party. But he convinced a lot of people that workers and the labor movement would have an ally when he was in office. The next year, there was another round of elections in the U.S., and something very different happened, which was the Republicans, and in particular the far right wing, the Tea Party, right, won really big in those elections. And in a number of states, I'm here, in a number of states, the Republicans got control of the governor's office, and in 21 states, Republicans controlled not only the governorship, but also both of the two houses of Congress in that state. In other words, they controlled all three of the bodies of policy making in the U.S. So they had serious domination politically. And when that happened, they went absolutely on the offensive. And they launched what amounted to an incredible attack on public sector unions. So within the first year and a half, in fact, really within the first year of that series of elections, so in 2011, more than 400 bills were introduced around the country that attacked public sector unions. In at least 22 or 23 states, new laws were proposed to do things like eliminate collective bargaining for public sector workers, to turn states into what are called right-to-work states. Right, in the U.S., some states are right to work and others are closed shop. What that means is that if you are in a closed shop state and you take a job at a company and that company workers are represented by a union, you're obligated to at least pay some portion of dues towards the union or to join the union. The right to work it's a Republican right-wing phrase. But effectively what it means is, even if there's a union at your workplace, and even though that union is obligated to represent you, and you get all the benefits of unionization, you're not obligated to join the union or pay any dues. And this has been a big conflict in the U.S. because it makes it very easy to chip away at unions if workers aren't obligated in some form to contribute to the union. So all across the country, there were big attacks on public sector workers. And it was very successful, and it was concentrated right in that same area of the Rust Belt where there's some remnants of a radical labor movement left in the U.S. And in all of those states, public sector workers' rights were seriously eroded. In Wisconsin, which is, by the way, here's Iowa, where I grew up. In this state of Wisconsin, Wisconsin is the place where public sector unions were born in the U.S., so it is very, very strong. Last year, public sector workers in Wisconsin lost entirely their rights to collective bargaining. Only police and firefighters still have the right to form unions, and now those are being chipped away at. So in the heart of this, the public sector union movement in the U.S., in the last 18 months, rights have been absolutely devastated and attacked. So you could start to see where I'm trying to go with some of this, is to look at what's the state of the economic situation in the U.S., and what's led to a situation in which workers have been so passive. And what I wanted to suggest, and I'm just jumping ahead and skipping some things I had to sort of wrap up with. What I'm trying to sort of point out is that to understand why it is that there hasn't been that much labor activism or working class mobilization in the US in the light of the economic collapse and everything else, you have to really look at not only how the composition of the working class in the US has changed, right, a shift away from industrial manufacturing work towards service sector work. You have to think about the context of Cold War ideology, in which anything that has even the slightest smell of socialism is deemed un-American and unpatriotic and traitorous. And at the same time, you had a 30-year gutting of unions in the manufacturing part of the U.S., the most militant, strongest unions, been gutted. And now, in the last few years, we see in the public sector, the last really vestiges of a viable labor movement in the U.S., that's suddenly come under very, very serious attack. So, it's in this context, I think, that you have to understand, like, on one hand, you can start to get a sense of, how has it been so hard for leftists and militants in the U.S. to generate activism around labor issues and working class issues? It's been chipped away physically, but also in people's minds, right, for several decades. But how bad it's gotten in the last few years since the economic crisis, and in this very, very overt and really disastrous frontal assault on public sector workers, in which not only unions are vilified, but public sector workers like teachers and nurses are being blamed for the economic crisis, right? People are being told that teachers are greedy and the unions don't care about the students, they only care about more money, all of this, they've been vilified. Now that all of this is coming together, the crisis economically, the political crisis and frustration people have been feeling, and then this massive attack on those few jobs in the U.S. that still have a sense of security and union organization. Out of this context, finally emerges this thing of the Occupy Wall Street movement, the sort of first signs of life in the working class in decades in the U.S. So that's where we'll go for the last part of the talk.
Luckily, it will be too depressing.
Yeah, I agree. She said luckily before we get too depressed. You see how demoralizing things have been for the left in the U.S. Right? The left is very disorganized, very weak, very fragmented, and it's been incredibly hard to figure out, in the context of this brutal assault on labor, how to rebuild those bonds of solidarity and an attitude that first workers have to build, first recapture something resembling class consciousness, but also then to figure out how to start to build a movement that can turn this stuff around. But the truth is, things have been quite depressing in the U.S. on this front. Okay, hope you're not too talk about it.